Good evening, everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many people here for what promises to be a really fantastic evening. I am Susan Juster. I'm the Director of Research here at the Huntington, and it is an honor and a privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. Nayan Shah is this year's Los Angeles Times Distinguished Fellow in American History and Culture, and is our neighbor down the road in his other life, where he is Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at USC. Yes, good. He is a scholar of impressive range, whose books uncover how people struggle with illness, migration, and incarceration in the United States and the wider world from the 19th century to the present. At the core of his work is a deeply empathetic interest in how power works on human bodies in pain, bodies in cages, bodies in rebellion. His 3 acclaimed books take on subjects as diverse as epidemics in San Francisco's Chinatown, South Asian migrant workers throughout the American West, and prison hunger strikes across the globe. The research for this last book alone came from archives on 5 continents, from the US to South Africa, France, the United Kingdom, Ireland, India, and Australia. All 3 books have garnered lavish praise. His 2001 book, Contagious Divides, is, in the words of one reviewer, a striking book that asks provocative questions and seamlessly weaves together narratives central to the history of race, Asian Americans, urban politics, public health, and citizenship. A decade later, Nayan published Stranger Intimacy, a breathtaking book, in the words of another fan, based on, quote, virtuoso research interlaced with a lucid and compelling analysis. And most recently, in 2022, he published a really remarkable book, I think, Refusal to Eat, A Century of Prison Hunger Strikes, a book that manages to be, in one reviewer's words, both a total history and a primer for contemporary activism. Shah materializes the agony of embodied suffering in a truly devastating, inspired read. Having followed Nayan's career through these books and engaged their arguments with my graduate students over the years, I am always struck by his compassion and his willingness to put himself into his scholarship. As he says in Refusal to Eat, writing this book tested me in every way, as a researcher, as a writer, as a person. It made me confront my sense of ethics and my doubts. I think it's this willingness to marry the academic and the personal that makes him such a good spokesperson for the humanities. Nayan's work has been featured in documentaries on Asian American history and the history of contagion and pandemics for PBS and the History Channel. And he's worked with the National Park Service, Angel Island Foundation, California Historical Society, and the New York Historical Society to interpret the Asian American past and present. During his time here with us at the Huntington, he co-wrote a post with another of our fellow, Patricia Yu, who's in the audience, for our blog Verso on the multiverse of Rakib Shah, whose splendid paintings were on display in a recent Huntington exhibition. It has been such a pleasure this year getting to know a scholar whose work I have long admired. Nayan's Huntington Project, which you'll hear more about in a moment, marks a new direction for him, away from institutions and disciplinary structures to the visual arts and the very personal stories of artists found in these paintings. It takes real courage to venture into a new field, especially with so many talented art historians among the long-term fellows here to offer guidance and critique, but it's a testament to Nayan's capacious curiosity and willingness to constantly learn from his sources and his colleagues. Please join me in welcoming Nayan Shah.
Thank you. Thanks, Sue, for that generous introduction. I want to commend you for your vigorous and visionary leadership of research here at the Huntington. All of us couldn't do what we do if you weren't here, guiding us, supporting us, encouraging us. It's been an honor to spend the year here as the LA Times Distinguished Fellow. I want to thank my community of long-term fellows, the curators, the staff for all their brilliant insights and generous engagement. I also want to share my gratitude for the everyday stewards of these marvelous libraries, gardens, and galleries. It's their labor that sustains this oasis, and I am so grateful for that. I'm also grateful for Mickey and Rashid, who are making this visually all happen, and acoustically. So as Sue shared, I'm venturing in new ground, and it's been wonderful to be here to be able to do that. And it's been really important to think about this research which is exploring the social and cultural history of Asian American visual art makers and art making from the 19-teens to the 1950s. I came to this research as a teacher, someone who had been researching and imparting to students and to the public the history of Asian American experience in the 19th and 20th century. In my lectures, I turned to Asian American artists for a different perspective. Attention to their creativity counterbalances the predominant archival record in the 19th and early 20th century that records what was done to Asian immigrants, how the state limited their lives, livelihood, and mobility, distorted their perspectives, muffled their voices. What's exciting in the artwork is showing us what artists cared about, what they struggled with, what perplexed them, what fascinated them. How did they make sense of the world in which they lived? Today I'm going to focus on just a few Japanese and Chinese American artists and their different approaches to attuning their sensitivity to the natural world's rhythms. I'm going to focus on Chiura Obata and a particular idea that he had, imploring artists to sharpen their perception and attune their sensitivity to these natural rhythms in the world. What he called, and what I use in my title, as life's continual vibrations and movements. So I'm following how Asian American artists in this period, the teens to the 40s, hiked and camped in mountains and seashores. I'm interested in the sensory immersion in nature because it had shaped their artistic experiments, their aesthetics, the stories of their lives. And it helps us understand something that I think is fundamental, which is Asian American artists, among many, created in a paradoxical era of both constraint and possibility. Let me for a moment draw up a picture of constraint. I'm going to condense a lot of the research I end up doing for the other books I've written, but here I'm going to tell you something about that I think many of us know, but I think we need to hear anew, which is in the early 20th century, a time of great American experimentation in how far the government could go to create a legal system of racial segregation and subordination. This was true for African Americans and Native Americans, and it was specific for Asian immigrants who were created as perpetual foreigners. Their compounded immigration restrictions by race and by gender, by class, on who could enter, shaped for Chinese and Japanese immigrants a blanket racial prohibition on naturalization for citizenship, making Asian Americans both legally and perpetually and culturally foreign well into the 1940s and 50s when the laws were rescinded, and culturally, I think, even to the present day. On top of that, states and localities raced to regulate where and with whom Asians could live and work. Laws prohibited their marriages with white people, property restrictions enforcing racial covenants on home ownership, alien land laws to prohibit their owning or leasing of farmland. In California, children were segregated in public schools and faced discrimination and disqualification in professions and jobs. And all along, they were haunted by the specter of white vigilante mob violence that drove out Chinese, Japanese, and later immigrants from India and the Philippines from their homes and communities until the 1930s across the US West. So it's now more remarkable to think about the possibilities and the opportunities. The very possibility of Asian artists working and creating in contemporary art in the United States arose out of profound growth in the US infrastructure of art training and exhibition in the 19-teens to 1930s. This was all created by individuals, the creation of nonprofits and foundations and just community activism, and a lot of energy from all kinds of different people. Some Chinese and Japanese art students joined the art schools and the galleries, the artist colonies. Their work was collected, it was auctioned off. It was all celebrating the living contemporary artist. To illustrate some of this, look at these two paintings, which were up in LACMA before it was brought down and before the reconstruction happens. In 1926, Miki Hayakawa painted a realistic portrait of an African-American man in a suit. She did it in the same studio as her friend and colleague Yun-Gin Gi, who painted Miki painting the portrait in a completely different style, a cubist kind of style. Both of these paintings were brought together in 2004 by the collecting practices of LACMA, and it was interesting to see the different ways in which bringing together these two paintings, which were created around the same time in the same kind of studio that Otis Odenfield taught them in, and which resulted in other organizations like galleries, like the Modern Art Gallery in San Francisco. These exhibits and these art journals create opportunities for Asian American artists to seize and tell their own story and explain their creative inspiration and the mediums in which they worked. For a historian, it's extraordinary to get glimpses of their creativity and perspective. Tonight, we're going to go on several journeys together with art and see this kind of immersive experience and creativity up close. We're going to be looking at Yasuo Kuniyoshi's drawings and paintings of Maine farms and seashores. We're going to be following Chiura Obata in Yosemite and the High Sierras. We're going to be looking at Chin-Chi Chung Lee's mountain fantasy, and then we're going to be going back into our own backyard, looking at Obata here in Pasadena. So let's begin. Kuniyoshi in Maine. The most unlikely spot, the seacoast of Maine. Beautiful, definitely, but let me set a scene for you. On a small rocky bluff on Perkins Cove in Algonquin, Maine, a spry Japanese man tends to a small garden of tomatoes, green beans, and vegetables. Henry Card, the dory fisherman who lent him the plot, scratched his head as to how an artist from New York City could grow such sweet tomatoes and large, tasty vegetables. Apparently, his secret sauce or fertilizer was decaying fish and seaweed. One morning, he woke up and to discover that a rooster had made a shambles of his tomatoes. And his friend, Robert Laurent, who's observing all of this, says that rather than rage, Kuniyoshi was inspired to do what artists do, draw that rooster. And it resulted in what Laurent said was one of his best pictures. How did Kuniyoshi find his way to Algonquin, Maine in 1918? He left his home in Okayama in Japan in 1906. He landed in Seattle at the age of 17. He left seeking adventure, escaping conscription in the Japanese military, and escaping the tensions between his parents, which led to their divorce 3 years after he left. His life was hard. He didn't really anticipate it. He thought something about America being, the place where the streets were paved with gold, and he really believed that. But he found that he worked in railway yards in Spokane, scrubbed floors in LA, harvested grapes and cantaloupes on farms. He did go to public high school here in LA, where a teacher noticed his artistic talents and encouraged him to pursue a career. He left for New York in 1910, continued working odd jobs, enrolling in different art schools, mostly dropping out of different art schools. His years were exhausting and lonely. Not until 1916, when he enrolled in the New York Art Students League, did he find inspiring teachers and a community of women and men, many of them immigrants, who became his lifelong friends. Kuniyoshi came to Perkins Cove at Algonquin at the invitation of art critic and collector Hamilton Easterfield, who bought a row of shacks for summer artist studios and started an art school there. When Yasuo Kuniyoshi, photographed here in 1923, and fellow art student Catherine Schmidt, who's his wife, when she was 19, they married against the wishes of her parents. Field came to their aid, and the couple married at Algonquin. He offered them a small apartment and studio in Brooklyn Heights to live during the year, and invited them to the summer studio in Maine. So I gave you a bunch of bio about him, but what I really want us to think about is at Perkins Cove, what kinds of experiences stimulated him. These are drawings that he did of artists and fishermen living together. The subjects of his early drawings and his paintings were alive with their summer discoveries. Kuniyoshi was fascinated by all forms of life on the farm and on the shore. You can see here the snakes and the fish and the octopus and the ubiquitous cows, and we'll talk more about the cows in a minute. You can also see things are wildly out of scale. These extraordinary plants that are growing, weeds and all kinds of things are part of what he's, trying to sort of bring into being. These paintings and drawings are dreamlike in different kinds of ways. Later in his career, Kuniyoshi would become famous for his figure drawings of melancholy women, of dancers, of circus performers. But in the 1920s, he was obsessed with cows. Kuniyoshi estimated that he painted or drew 60 cows in 2 or 3 years. His first gallery show in 1922 revealed this fixation, and critics found his obsession with cows humorous. Kuniyoshi insisted, "I wasn't trying to be funny, but everyone thought I was." He explained his curiosity. I just think cows are kind of ugly. They're irregular. They're strange. They're open to interpretation in a way that's impossible for a horse, which is just a splendid animal. And he really didn't draw horses, but he did paint frequently. And many of these paintings, and you'll sort of note, they show up in the Whitney's collection, National Gallery of Art, Columbus Museum, because many collectors were very fascinated with his attention to this bucolic world, and using also a kind of folk art style. He was really, Field himself was a collector of folk art, among many other things, including Japanese prints, which we'll talk about later. But he inspired Kuniyoshi, who started collecting decorative and vintage objects and often referencing them in his work. His interpretation of American folk style enchanted Juliana Force, who ran the Whitney Studio Club, which was the predecessor of the Whitney Museum of American Art, and Edith Halpert, the owner of the influential Downtown Gallery in New York, who exhibited Kuniyoshi's paintings and drawings. Kuniyoshi was a supremely social person. He was very much engaged in a world of friendship and community in Algonquin, in Brooklyn. He's someone who enjoyed the community and conviviality with people. He loved to cook, he loved to play cards, he loved to argue, he loved to drink, he loved to play cards, he loved to drink, argue. This went on and on. He was just an extraordinarily social person and gregarious one. He said he was so lonely for so many years that once he found this community, he sustained with them. And he continues to work in Algonquin during the summers, and he continues to work in Woodstock, New York, where after he did finally sell a bunch of paintings, he ended up buying a piece of land and building a house where he continued to go until the end of his life. We're going to turn now to Obata and his Yosemite journey. In 1927, Chiura Obata left his wife Haruko and their 4 children, including a newborn daughter, behind at home in San Francisco's Japantown when he took a 2-month-long guy's trip up to the Sierra Mountains. His buddy, Worth Ryder, a fellow artist, an art professor at UC Berkeley, organized the expedition. Ryder was an experienced hiker and trekker and guide. He and 42-year-old Obata just relied on every part of Ryder's expertise, his contacts and resources to make the trip to Yosemite Valley and the High Sierras possible. Ryder packed up a car with 2 beds, 14 boxes of food, painting materials, fishing gear, 2 suitcases, a tent for their 2-month camping trip. What we know about Obata's experiences on this trip were through the frequent letters he wrote to Haruko and the columns he wrote for a Japanese language newspaper in San Francisco. What we learn is that the immense and intricate scenery absorbed Obata. His descriptions are poetic, climbing up the path along Tioga Road on the upper rim of Yosemite Park, a road, incidentally, that was constructed by Chinese workers in 1883. Obata wrote about being enveloped in a forest of copper-colored sugar pines, dark black firs, and buoyed by the sights of, quote, rolling blue ridges and the snowy peaks above them. He was interested in this towering forest, and he drank in the vibrant atmosphere. He speaks a great deal about his senses. His senses are amplified here. The air in the high mountains, he says, is so clean, and the trees and the grass and the birds and the flowers are fascinating beyond description. Beautiful flowers bloom in a stream of icy water. Whenever the hikers would pause and rest, Obata would seize an opportunity to sketch. The sculptor Robert Boardman Howard marveled at how little preparation Obata needed to work. He was just somehow always ready, at least for a brief sketch. Now, this photograph is actually taken in 1948 when the Sierra Club actually invites Obata to come to the High Sierra camps and do different kinds of demonstrations. He's clearly much better prepared here. But when Obata left Japan at 17 and arrived in Seattle, 1903, like Kuniyoshi, he had no idea this would actually be part of his life and experience. He worked as a domestic servant, a laborer. He harvested crops in San Francisco and California. Obata was the youngest of 8, and both his parents died soon after he was born. He was adopted and raised by his older brother, a talented painter, and Obata came to America after training in Japan, in Japanese, Chinese, and Western art styles. He's unusual in that regard. He's one of the few artists who had really deep training before he came to the United States. In the 19-teens, Obata found regular work as an illustrator in Japanese language newspapers and magazines, and later worked on commissions for the San Francisco Opera, and he did powder rooms in the walls of Gump and other department stores. The paintings he exhibited began work that he was doing in the 1920s, expressed his fascination with the natural environment. It led him to paint the landscapes of the Carmel Coast and the farms in the Central Valley, where he knew other Japanese Americans, and he would spend time with them. When he came to Yosemite, on that all-guys trip, Obata relished the solitude, away from his family, from work, from the turbulence of city life. In the Yosemite wilderness, Obata marveled at regaining feeling in, quote, my eyes, my ears, my hands, my feet, my whole body and my mind are reacting at high speed. In San Francisco, it was hardly reacting to the streetcars, the automobiles, the phones. The sensations in his body were heightened once removed from that intensity and pace and noise of the modern city. They were reawakened by what he called great nature. The pursuit of a subject's liveness is really at the core of Obata's aesthetic philosophy and practice. I want to take a moment and think a little bit about that as we then reflect on his artwork. Obata believed that life consisted of continual vibrations and movements, as I invoked before. And he believed that the artist's goal was to convey those vibrations to our artistic perception. Obata spoke passionately of the aim of, quote, going with nature. What he meant was reorienting human sensitivity to the rhythmical activities of heaven and earth. This retuning would help one live in harmony with the universe, rather than being blockaded psychically within the constraints of human society. He embraced the ephemeral moment, the fleeting atmospheric wonder of weather patterns, and vitality of seasons erupting and changing. And he savored that as exposure on his own body. He writes a lot, and in fact, even in the newspapers, about his early morning baths in the streams, about the hot sun on his body, of being turned a nut brown suntan, about being mistaken for being a native person in Yosemite. He and his companions were big fans of nude forest bathing, with its joyful rejection of conventional life rhythms. His heightened consciousness of his own body and the sensations of the environment were so important to him. So when he's talking about Yosemite, he's really invoking that. And we have something very special with the fact that he's doing a lot of sketching and drawing, and then he's writing these letters and these reports back. And he talks a great deal in this painting, Before Thunderstorm, Tuolumne High Sierra, of the music that's being created around him, and that's what he's enthralled with. Thunder rumbles and roars through the vast meadow like a huge orchestra, he says, at the height of its frenzied rendition of an overture, announcing the coming of a storm. Obata transposes and aligns the movement in the visual with the oral. After the passing of the thunderstorm, the freshly brightened colors vanish as the evening falls. And what he's interested in here, and you can sort of see this, is he's looking at both the dark skies and the lightness that comes up afterwards. And he's trying to measure that against the forests and the greens. And this is all a woodblock print, and I want us to be aware of that. It's a print that's done after it's created a year later, a year and a half later, from his actual experience here. But he's trying to sort of hear what's happening in the thunderstorm. He's talking about the deep blues turning into purple, and one can still hear the melody of 1,000 streams. And it's in this process that he believes nature reveals itself. The second image, also in the high Sierras, Silence, Last Twilight, an unknown lake beneath Johnson Peak. In another memory, Obata recalls how moved he is by the overwhelming strange music of the mountains. He's puzzled by the strange sound that he hears. At first he thinks it's wind whistling through the pines. Then his eyes pinpoint the tens of thousands of lines of perpetual snow. And what he's really trying to get us to think about is the music emanating from the sun's heat melting the hard snow. When the snow melts, it rubs the rock, and that's the sound you hear. The glaciers melting in thin tracks, which he says are alternating in blue and pink hues in the sunlight. Obata describes what he did in this time in Yosemite and in the high Sierras in particular as a great harvest of my whole life and my future in painting. He made 150 pencil sketches, sumi brush paintings, and watercolors in the high Sierras, Yosemite Valley, and Mono Lake. He exhibited these watercolors and drawings in one-man exhibitions the year afterwards in the Bay Area and other parts of California. The watercolors and sketches that Obata produced in Yosemite in 1927 served as the models for an innovative portfolio of woodblock prints that he produced in Japan over 18 months. This was called Obata's World Landscape Series America. It was comprised of 35 color woodblock prints, and it used scenes from California. 27 of them were views of Yosemite and the High Sierra country to represent all of America. So he was very ambitious here, but just a really amazing site to do the work. So I want us to take a look at a different artist here. Chi-Chin Lee is an artist who goes by many different names during his lifetime. He created his work called Mountain Fantasy. The energy that moved Obata found strikingly different expression in the work of this Chinese-American artist who was painting at the same time. He was born in Guangzhou in 1896. His father has a thriving herbalist business in San Francisco. In 1914, Chi's brother and he immigrate as sons of merchants to the United States with the aim of taking over the family business. That does not go so well. In 1918, he enrolls in the California School of Fine Arts when he received prizes for his oil painting. He then finds that painting doesn't pay. He works as a hotel manager, later a sales clerk to support himself. This painting, Mountain Fantasy, was done several different times. The version we have here is 1933. It captivated me the first time I saw it in an exhibition in the De Young Museum in 2008. It was the centerpiece of an exhibit 80 years before in the 1935 Chinese Art Association show, also at the De Young. It was in a private collection and rarely seen publicly. In 2024, the Smithsonian American Art Museum acquired the painting, and in March of this year, it was unveiled on the second floor of the museum among 19th and 20th century landscapes. This is my photograph of it. It doesn't include my mother and my cousin who are also looking at this painting and wondering what I'm thinking and seeing here. But in my family, going to museums and art going is collective. What I want us to think about here, and maybe you've been noticing it as it's been up here, is all these different figures that are in the rock face. Mountain Fantasy is a richly colored oil painting. Its colors are so intensely vibrant. Our gaze is directed, perhaps, to the nude woman that's here, gazing up. She's looking up what looks like a waterfall, but also to these rock faces in a prayerful pose. The jagged rock faces are alive with these polymorphous nude figures that are crowded together in different ways. They recline, they stand, they contort, they embrace, they kiss. Some critics have likened these figures to the Pacific Coast Native American totems or archaeological discoveries of the Olmec, head sculptures. Chinchi Li was strongly influenced by Mexican muralist Diego Rivera when he was working in San Francisco. But I think the liveness here of the spirits manifests bodily the sensation of living chi, of a kind of life force of nature, an animistic belief as well that reveals powerful spirits in the natural world. Chinchi makes manifest indigenous presence and stewardship over the land, and maybe there as well their anguish and unknowing about what is happening with that conquest and the exploitation of the lands. But this scene is quite striking because it's so unique about the kind of paintings that he did. We have this image of him actually drawing, because Pauline Vincent, who was a fellow WPA worker, they together made hundreds of prints and drawings of street and park scenes in San Francisco Bay Area. But none of these paintings on his part reveal so explicitly the figuration of ancestors and spirits. So now, the thing I teased you with in the poster, let's look a little bit at this image. I'm going to go back one. So this is in the Huntington's collection. It came to the Huntington as a 2019 donation from the Obata family. The print is a unique image of Southern California, the World Landscape Series. All of the 34 prints depict wild landscapes, the High Sierras, Yosemite, Monterey. But what I was fascinated with was what brought Chiura Obata to Pasadena. How did he create the subject of this painting? This print launched my nerdy historian art detective story. I bothered and troubled so many of the curators here, archivists, people in the community. I was able to speak with Obata's granddaughter to develop some degree of clue about what he's doing here. He didn't receive any receipts or letters to give us insights, but we have a clue about his coming to Pasadena, about when that happened. When I traveled to Washington, D.C., I went to the art collection of the Museum of Asian Art. In their study center are a whole series of notebooks, accordion-style notebooks, Japanese notebooks that Obata created. And those notebooks are full of sketches and watercolors of landscapes, of farmhouses and wisteria gardens from his trip to the Central Valley in Southern California. When curator Diana Greenwald turned the page, and there were these two striking drawings of the bridge. The one on the right is one perspective, looking as you look head-on directly into the bridge here. Oh, sorry, giving you a little more than I wanted to. I'm telling the story all over again. Okay, so you can see I was warned this would happen, that I would go too fast. So these images that I have here are really high-resolution images. They're wonderful, but they take a little while to load. Anyway, so you have these two, the prints, and obviously the one on the left looks like what he ends up drawing. So We know that he was drawing this, and I think by now, you might also presume, if you are like me, who live in Pasadena, West Pasadena, or go through the Colorado Bridge, it's very much a kind of vision of the Colorado Bridge. It's not the bridge exactly, but there's something about the sort of spirit of this Colorado Street Bridge, a historic Beaux Arts design built over 18 months, opened in 1913, that this concrete bridge spans the Arroyo Seco. It soars about 150 feet above the stream bed at its tallest. In the 1920s, there was actually a stream bed there, not the concrete that's there now. It was hailed as one of the longest and tallest bridges in Southern California when it was made. It has supported by 11 arches. The structure is more impressive because of the two structural quirks, the 52-degree curve in the bridge's center and the constant 2.65% grade that connects the east bank that is 30 feet higher than the west. We know that these notebooks are from 1927 and 28. When I reached out to Obata's granddaughter, Kimi Kodani Hill, for any information about Pasadena connections, she said she knew that Obata had traveled for a series of one-man shows in San Jose and Monterey and Fresno and Los Angeles. The exhibit included various different drawings and paintings from the Sierra trip, from the coastline, and portraits as well. But what I wanted to know and speculate about was how he got down to the Arroyo Seco. How did he get that view of the bridge? The perspective is from below and the southeast side of the canyon. But we also know a lot about what's happening in the Pasadena community, and I think it's worthwhile to know and remember this. The Pasadena History Museum and local community historians have informed me about the large Japanese-American community in Old Town Pasadena in the 1920s and 30s. The Pasadena City Directories for 1921 and 22 and 1930 found many Japanese listings for laundries and hotels, furnished room houses, dry goods stores, gardeners, and several fruit and vegetable dealers. We know of two art shops that actually existed, the Hatani shop in the Maryland Hotel on Colorado Boulevard and the Yamamoto one on 102 East Colorado that carried a complete line of Japanese art goods, drawn work, and kimonos. We also know about the Pasadena Union Church, which was established in 1913. Obata may have found his way down into the Arroyo because he had been guided there by friends or fellow artists. He could come down the eastern bank near Old Town Pasadena and from the historic Vista del Arroyo Hotel. He met friends, he hung out with people, and I like to think about people eating and laughing and playing games and maybe throwing baseballs. Did I mention that Obata used to pitch for a baseball team in San Francisco in 1903, 1905? Maybe he took a moment to throw a few pitches or watch the kids playing tag. But what he's interested in is what happens at dusk. When people depart and the natural world comes alive, the cacophony of birdsong at dusk and the crickets and the insects and the rustling wind and the car noises and the bridge and the street. He turns to sketching then. And how does he represent this full moon Pasadena? You have an opportunity to see how he turns one arch out of the 11 in his composition, makes it stand for the entire span. The graceful arch of the Colorado Street Bridge echoes the curve of the full moon. The moon is underneath the bridge. By placing it beneath it, the curving span is highlighted. The trees on either side of the archway have leaves. They appear detailed facing in. The foliage underneath is more abstract as it lightens in the grayish wash with the dark dappled leaves on the left side. And you can see that there's a kind of optical illusion here at the top where it looks like the trees are higher than or as high as the bridge itself, but that's just the perspective of looking up. When I looked at the image more carefully, I puzzled over the timing. It's really interesting to see this dark sky above and the light sky below. And I thought about this idea of how it's the effect perhaps of the twilight hour. It's a time when the sun is setting, dropping in the western skies below the horizon, the hills or the mountains. Maybe not precise, but something that he takes in his imagination, his memory. The full moon is rising and the moonlight is reflecting. Obata loved watching the moon. And he would leave Berkeley, where he was an art professor, and he would journey into the Santa Cruz Mountains, because in those mountains, it was so deep. You could wait for the sunset, you could hear the crickets, he said, and slowly behind the woods, the moon emerges. So he's really interested in this kind of phenomena. Some other elements that are really important for us to understand here is a little bit about woodblock printing itself. And I want to give you a very quick explanation of this. I apologize to all art historians everywhere for doing this, but Japanese woodblock prints reveal a robust transcultural art influence. We often think of influences going from Europe to the rest of the world. Well, here's a case of influences from Asia impacting Europe and America. In the late 18th and 19th century, in Japan, for the Japanese art community itself, there were innovations in color printing that were occurring, in techniques and perspectives and design in woodblock printing. It was a golden age of Japanese woodblock prints, and there was a bustling set of businesses that were going on. This floating world of kabuki theater and courtesans. There was also more landscape scenery in the foreground and lots of pictorial surveys of landmarks or the views of Mount Fuji. Prints by artists like Hiroshige and Hokusai became highly prized among connoisseurs in Japan. But it's in the mid-19th century when the United States unceremoniously opens up Japan to the world that these prints find their way to French Impressionist painters like Monet and Degas and Van Gogh, as well as American artists Whistler and Cassé, who were riveted and inspired by their close-cropped compositions and unusual angles and perspectives and the use of flat and bold color patterns. Europeans and Americans started collecting when the Japanese lost interest in this. They were like waiting for the next thing, but the Americans were really into this thing. So some of these new images were also done for the US and European markets. And the market interest was established and pursued by Yoshida Hiroshi, who was a successful Western-style Japanese painter who turned to woodblock printing in the 1920s after visiting Europe and the United States many times since 1900. He exhibited and sold his prints particularly in the 1920s and 30s, and here we see a print created in 1925 after his trip to Yosemite. He also did Grand Canyon and other sites in the world, including traveling all over the world. There's sites of Taj Mahal and Bangkok and temples there and the like. But the creation of the woodblock print is really important for us to understand. It's not a singular creation of one artist. It's a labor-intensive, expensive, and time-consuming group project. The work that the Takamizawa color print studio does in persuading Obata that there could be a market for 100 portfolios of 35 woodblock prints with the subject of California comes about because they assemble 32 wood carvers and 40 printers for 18 months. The publisher ordinarily hired and paid the carvers and printers, assumed all financial risks. In this case, Obata commissioned the project and paid for it from his savings. Obata intervened frequently in rejecting the carvings and the printings that did not reflect his vision. He had progressive proofs made after each printing stage. It was a very costly and unusual practice. So I want us to understand this process here. By the way, Hiroshi sometimes used 30 impressions to create that print that we just saw. Obata's World Landscape series had more than 100 impressions. Full Moon Pasadena was produced by a remarkable 123 impressions. Why did he do this? What was the intent? The colors, the way that they're using printing to produce the effect of watercolor and the saturation of washes. And what we see here, because the Obata family also donated all the progressive prints to us, and I got a chance to see it in the study room in the Art Museum. With my friend and colleague, Patricia Yu, we got to see the different ways in which this happens. The first couple of prints are actually white. Black and gray is introduced in print number 3. And we begin to see, we see the contours of the bridge, the moon, the edges of the trees. In print number 20, we begin to see a lot more of the contrasts that are going on. And we see a lot of the leaves that are being played out and even what's below in these hills. It's actually not until print number 40 that the blue color that's so important is even introduced. And then impression upon impression upon impression continues. We notice there was this spackling that's occurring, which is really giving more room for deeper and deeper indentations of the midnight blue. We begin to see the aquamarine sort of emerge in print number 60 and 61. And by 66 and 67, a lot of the spackling begins to recede because it's being saturated with color. In 99, we see orange introduced into the lamp, but an orange below. We're seeing all these different effects. What they're trying to create is this deepness of the watercolor effect in a totally different medium. It's like this incredible move of a virtuoso display of mastery, ingenuity, and great skill. You want a woodblock print? I'm going to give you a watercolor that's in woodblock print. It's a deeper mission, though, I think, into Obata's deliberate, time-consuming demands. I want to return to the title phrase here of this lecture, life's continual vibrations. Life. It's his call as an artist and a student, and to students and to all of us, to be sensitive and attuned to express the vibrations of life in the natural world, to immerse yourself in what life can be and what it is, in all of its craziness and magnificence, in all of its astounding particularities, in what he called abundant great nature of America, and listening to what nature tries to tell us. It's a continuous process. These artists are fascinated with every changing, mutating, ephemeral experience of life, the attention to the atmosphere, to the weather, to the clouds, the sky, to the wind and the temperature. And it's about vibration in this kind of really awesome way. We're thinking about moving across time and space. We're talking about the vibrations that occur between living things, between humans and the world around us. It's apprehending it bodily through all of your senses. Maybe for you, it's the chill of nightfall, the scent of trees, the plants, the sounds of birds and coyotes. It's atmospheric and experienced in your body, in our minds, and our spirit. This is something that's really astounding to think about in terms of an art object, something that's fixed, that can be appraised and viewed. A woodblock print, a drawing, a watercolor, an oil painting. But let's think about these objects as being something that can be experienced. It's a communication between artist and viewer of the experience. The viewers are bringing their own experience, their own feeling to the art. The process of exploring Obata's many creations of the full moon Pasadena, the sketches, the watercolor, the progressive woodblock print, emphasizes art making as a continual creation. And we're seeing a deepening of color and shading and line and shadow to create our own perception of a deeper, multidimensional world, which is than what is available at first glance. It's an elusive and ephemeral, as well as a powerful, beckoning, embracing sense of wonder. Even in the most adverse conditions and settings, we can sense that creation is greater than oneself. When we look at the painting or drawing and imagine an artist, we often think of solo activity. Perhaps it's more interesting to think of this in terms of what Kuniyoshi and Obata and Lee were interested in, which is what is the process of creativity that's social, collaborative, communal. Not only what it's brought together in its creation, but how art and feeling conveys its experience and share. This evening's journey is an exploration of art inspired by environmental consciousness, a capacious feeling of connection with the natural world. Artists poured the elixir of nature's vibrancy into their visual art. And the sense of belonging that they did is something that attunes, I think, all of us to the natural world. It's a zeal to communicate that artists see and what we can see through their creation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nayan. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. If you put your hand up, I will walk around and give you the microphone.
Hi, Nayan. Lily here. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. My question about the Japanese American or Japanese artists in particular, because some of them worked, before World War II, and I imagine lived through World War II, and lived on the West Coast. So I'm wondering, in their artistic practice and in their as human beings, were they affected? Did they get put into the camps? If they did their art continue through incarceration?
Yeah, Lily, that's a really great question. Lily Crystal is the artistic director of East West Players. I'm also, and we are so glad to have her here. And I wanted to just say that I really struggled with keeping this talk short, and if I gotten into incarceration, it would have gotten a lot longer. But I did imagine that we would be thinking about them. So Obata is really important and interesting because he, among many artists, came into the camps, found this incredible sense of grief at what had happened to him, to the children, to the elderly Issei. But his idea of what to do was to create an art school. So within 3 days of being in Tanforan, he collected his friends that were artists in the Bay Area that were also in Tanforan, and they created an art school. And they started teaching young people how to create art. But it wasn't just classes that happened from 9 to 9 for young people, but also first generation Issei who were creating work for the first time, mothers and fathers who were trying to struggle with creating all kinds of different work. And so this continues to Topaz. It also shapes their artistic practice. So there's such an incredible body of work that, I really believe Karen Higa, who was this extraordinary curator at Janum, who passed too soon, had really begun to sort of share with us this rich artistic legacy. But it's very much important to understand that images of the moon, of the sky, of the clouds become some of the kinds of paintings that people like Chiura Obata, Hisako Hibe use as ways of thinking about fleeing the place that they're in and imagining a different world, a world otherwise, as well as documenting the experiences in the camps. So thank you so much for that question. As we're doing that, I can actually show you some of these photographs. This is Obata's drawings.
Hi, Professor Shah. Thank you for this amazing talk. I'm a student in your department, and I work on the artwork of Kei Sekimachi, who, as you know very well, was a student of Obata at Tanforan. And this was just so incredible. I was really taken by what you described as the social nature of creativity and your reading of that expression in the artworks. I was wondering if you could speak more on that, and in particular, you're thinking about the medium of the works, because your observations about the wood print was so interesting. I wanted to hear more about how the medium specificity of the print or of the oils permitted or limited, or in what way changed what is the social and what is the creative.
So I think woodblock printing for me was when I first understood this is the work that we see of Obata's, and understood its collective nature and the intense labor that's going on into its work. Thinking that Obata as the artist is the one who conceives of and does the watercolor painting, right? And that watercolor painting then has to be reimagined by the carvers who are in cherry wood trying to carve out in reverse what the impressions are. And then they have to constantly work with printers to figure out how to sort of layer these different processes. So it's a very intense process which Obata demanded progressive proofs of the process because he wanted to control how every element worked out. So he's collaborating, he's rejecting proofs, he's sort of accepting them in different ways. He's really trying to create his artistic stamp. And this is true for woodblock printing as well. The publishers are really important. They are working with particular artists who they see as the ones that they're going to market, but yet they're actually marketing a collective product that very rarely do we understand who the carvers were or who some of the printers were, but they were master craftsmen and artists in their own right. And this was part of, and Obata had a great deal of respect for them and really wanted to work very intensely with them. So I think it's really an interesting way of thinking about that, and maybe a little different than thinking about the kinds of approaches that people take to, say, watercolor or ink drawing. But even then, there's a kind of collaboration, I think, occurs between artists as they're viewing things, or between the people who come and watch an artist at work. Don Kingman talks about how he constantly would be working with his watercolors out in the open, and he relished what people would see in them, and also what confused them, or what they fantasized about, or what they wanted to see. Those dialogues really helped him sort of understand what he was creating, as well as how he communicated it.
Hi. Thanks. This was really fascinating. I was curious with the Chiura's full moon painting. It looks like mountains in the background.
This one?
No, in the full moon, the Colorado Street Bridge.
Yeah, right,
so,
right.
like in the photograph of the bridge you showed us, it's looking south.
Yeah.
And then it's this suggestion of like mountains. Like, is this actually looking north to the San Gabriel Mountains, or are these like fantasy mountains?
Exactly. So I kept on like trying to understand, like it's facing north. It's facing north. And the mountains and the hills, I mean, the clearest I can sort of see, because I pass this all the time. I go down to the Rose Bowl pool, and I'm coming back, and I'm looking at the different parks and stuff like that. And it's the ridgeline hills. It's not the far mountains. It's not the San Gabriels. It's actually the ridgeline. But what I want us to sort of appreciate is that he drew that sketch, right, in 28, and then he goes to, with these notebooks, a year, the end of that year, to Japan. And then maybe as he's going through all the different things and he's trying to figure out what he wants to do next, they're like, oh, this looks like a really interesting idea. And then he's sort of from memory and from his own fantasy sort of thinking about it. So I don't think of it as an exact reproduction of what we would imagine for those of us who are there. But what I also really appreciate with you doing that, and I hope it stimulates us, I hope we all go down into the Arroyo and start looking, right? And try to imagine what this was like. And that's a little bit of what's so joyful about it for me, and so fascinating. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I think I have time for one more.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm wondering how many of these prints were eventually produced, and are they signed prints?
Yeah. So the actual portfolio of the woodblock prints, they are signed, and the watercolors themselves are signed, but the progressive prints are not necessarily. You know, all the progressive prints that I showed are, you know, they often have a stamp on them. They were just in the process of their creation. And if, you know, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, I'm the first one that requested reproductions of them. They're not something that they're part of the study center of drawings. They help us understand the process, but they're thought of as incidental, they're thought of as process-oriented towards the finished product. What's interesting as well is that we don't know what happened to all 100 printed portfolios, each of them with 35 prints in them. Some of them have disappeared. There's very few full collections in the United States, but you know, we had a major war, World War II, and destruction both in Japan and in the United States and people's lives. Astonishingly, all of this collection of the Obata family comes from a friend or friends safeguarding all these prints for Obata. I mean, there's only so much you could actually take into the camps. So it's really astonishing and important that they were retained and they were returned to the Obata family, and they continue to be part of their legacy. Oh, and one last thing, I just want to do this. I'm inspired by this project because of my parents. My father and my mother, they came to the United States in the late 50s. They went car camping everywhere. They took a Rambler, I don't know, from Washington, D.C. to Michigan, they ended up in the Tetons. And I think it's just a real tribute to my dad's eye, and this is a picture of my mom in 1963 at Yellowstone Falls, that really inspired me to explore what we take from the natural world, how we try to create art that also is deeply personal and meaningful.
And Nayan's mom is here with us tonight, too. So thank you. What a wonderful evening. Please join me again.